The desert night was cool against Elizabeth Foster's skin as she crept through the shadows behind her father's trading post. Moonlight silvered the landscape, casting long shadows across the hard-packed earth of Coyote Springs, Arizona territory. Her heart hammered in her chest as she secured the final saddlebag to her dappled mare. 22 years old and running away like a child. But what choice did she have? The arrangement her father had made with the Apache warrior Swift Arrow was unbearable. Elizabeth had no intention of becoming the bride of any man, let alone one from a culture so different from her own. She glanced back at the trading post, the only home she'd known since arriving in the territory 3 years ago. Samuel Foster had built this place from nothing after her mother's death drove them west from Boston. Now he was trading his only daughter like merchandise to secure better trading relations with the local Apache band. For our survival, he'd told her, his weathered face betraying no emotion. Elizabeth tightened her grip on the reins. Boston was too far, but Santa Fe wasn't. She had a cousin there. She could make a new life. I'd like to take a moment to ask you to please subscribe to the channel. I'm curious, what city are you watching from? Now, let's get back to our story about Elizabeth and her desperate escape. The sound of approaching footsteps froze her blood. Elizabeth turned slowly, praying it was just a ranch hand or a late-night customer. Instead, she found herself staring into the penetrating dark eyes of Swift Arrow himself, his tall figure unnervingly still in the moonlight. Her breath caught in her throat. Even in the darkness, his presence commanded attention. Broad-shouldered and powerful, dressed in a curious blend of traditional Apache garments and elements of white man's clothing. A decorated leather vest covered his muscled chest, while a knife hung at his hip alongside an Army Colt revolver. His long black hair was tied back with a leather strip, revealing the sharp angles of his face. At 35, Swift Arrow had earned respect among both his people and the white settlers for his fairness and strength, serving as a liaison between worlds growing increasingly entangled. Going somewhere, Elizabeth Foster? His deep voice carried a slight accent, but his English was nearly perfect, the result of years at a government school before he'd escaped back to his people. Elizabeth lifted her chin defiantly, though fear coursed through her veins. This arrangement is between you and my father. I never agreed to it. Swift Arrow took a step forward, his movements measured and deliberate. Your father understands what many white settlers do not, that times are changing. The old ways of bloodshed between our peoples benefit no one. His gaze traveled over her preparations with an unsettling calmness. Running away won't change what must be. By sunrise tomorrow, you will be my bride. The certainty in his voice sent a chill down Elizabeth's spine. She backed away, pressing against her horse. I'd rather die than be forced into marriage with a stranger. Swift Arrow's expression remained impassive, though something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps irritation, perhaps amusement. You know nothing of death, Elizabeth Foster. Or of me. He gestured toward the vast darkness beyond the trading post. Out there alone you would find one but not the other. The desert shows no mercy to those who don't respect it. Elizabeth's hand moved to the small revolver hidden in her skirt pocket. Her father's old Derringer, loaded with 2 precious bullets. Swift Arrow noticed the movement, and his lips curved slightly. You would shoot me rather than hear what I offer? What could you possibly offer that would make me accept this transaction? Elizabeth hissed, her fingers still wrapped around the hidden gun. Swift Arrow stepped closer. close enough that she could see the scar that ran along his jawline, a remnant of some past violence. "Time," he said simply. "1 month. Come with me to my people's camp as my guest, not my bride. Learn our ways. If after 1 month you still wish to leave, I will personally escort you to Santa Fe." Elizabeth blinked in surprise, suspicion immediately flooding her mind. "And I'm supposed to trust the word of an Apache warrior?" Something dangerous flashed in Swift Arrow's eyes. "I have many names among your people, Elizabeth Foster. Liar is not one of them." He held her gaze steadily. 1 month, then decide. Elizabeth's mind raced. Was this a trick? A month would give her time to plan a more careful escape. Or perhaps she pushed the thought away. "How did you know I was leaving tonight?" "Your father told me of your reluctance." Swift Arrow's voice carried a hint of dry amusement. "I've been watching the trading post for 3 nights. Elizabeth felt her face flush with anger at both her father's betrayal and the warrior's arrogance. "So you've been spying on me?" Swift Arrow shrugged one powerful shoulder. "I've been protecting my investment." Before Elizabeth could respond to that infuriating statement, he continued, "The desert is dangerous at night. Bandits, wild animals, the elements themselves. A woman alone would be fortunate to survive until dawn." He gestured toward the darkness beyond the trading post. "Even if you evaded me, others would find you. Men with less honorable intentions." Elizabeth knew he spoke the truth. The territories were lawless in many ways. Despite the efforts of overworked marshals and sheriffs, women traveling alone were particularly vulnerable. She had heard the whispered stories in the trading post, stories that gave her nightmares. Still, the thought of submitting to this arrangement made her stomach turn. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" she asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Swift Arrow's expression hardened. "Then I will carry you back to your father's house and post guards until our wedding at sunrise. The choice is yours, but know this: I will have my bride, Elizabeth Foster. The question is whether she comes willingly or fighting." The arrogance in his tone sparked Elizabeth's temper. "You speak of choice, but offer none. This is kidnapping, no matter how you dress it up with pretty words about cultural understanding." Swift Arrow remained unperturbed by her outburst. "Your father and I have an agreement. Among my people, such arrangements are honored." He paused, studying her with those penetrating eyes. "But I would prefer a wife who comes to me with an open mind, if not yet an open heart." Elizabeth wanted to scream with frustration. The man spoke as if his reasoning was perfectly sound, as if her objections were merely the tantrums of a child. Yet something in his steady gaze made her wonder if there was more to this arranged marriage than she understood. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. "There must be women among your own people who would be more suitable." Swift Arrow's expression shifted slightly, revealing a complexity she hadn't expected. "Times change, Elizabeth Foster. The old ways are dying. My people face a choice: adapt or perish." He gestured toward the trading post. "Your father understands this. He trades fairly with the Apache when others would cheat us. He learns our language when others mock it." His eyes bore into hers. "A union between us would strengthen both our peoples. Children of mixed blood, raised to respect both worlds, they might have a future when others do not." Elizabeth felt a flush creep up her neck at his mention of children. The thought of bearing this man's offspring had never even entered her mind, and now it hung in the air between them. "So I'm to be a bridge between cultures? A political arrangement?" Swift Arrow's mouth curved in a hint of a smile. "You are more than that, Elizabeth Foster. I have watched you these past months. You are strong-willed, intelligent, and unafraid to speak your mind. Rare qualities that would serve you well among my people. Elizabeth wasn't sure if she should be flattered or horrified that he had been observing her for months without her knowledge. The night breeze picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely howl echoing across the desert. Swift Arrow glanced toward the sound, then back at her. Dawn approaches. Make your decision. Elizabeth weighed her options. Running held little promise of success, especially now that she knew Swift Arrow had anticipated her escape. Returning to her father's house would only delay the inevitable. But a month as Swift Arrow's guest? That might give her the opportunity she needed. If I agree to this month, she said carefully, I want your word that I will be treated with respect. No liberties are to be taken. Swift Arrow's expression darkened. I am not a savage, despite what your people believe. You will be under my protection, not my possession, until you make your choice. Elizabeth took a deep breath. Very well, 1 month. But I make no promises beyond that. Swift Arrow nodded once, satisfaction evident in his bearing. We leave now. Your father knows you will be with me. Elizabeth bristled at the presumption. You were that certain I would agree? The warrior's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. I was certain only that you are too intelligent to choose death in the desert over life with my people. He moved toward her horse, checking the saddle with expert hands. Your preparations are good, but you packed too little water. The desert is unforgiving of such mistakes. Elizabeth watched him, noting the confident way he handled himself, the careful attention he paid to the details that might mean survival. Despite everything, she found herself curious about this man who moved between worlds, speaking her language while carrying himself with the unmistakable dignity of his people. Perhaps this month would reveal more than just an opportunity to escape. Perhaps it would show her a side of the territory and its people that she had never truly understood before. As they rode away from the trading post, Elizabeth cast one last glance at her father's establishment. Samuel Foster stood in the doorway, a lantern in his hand casting long shadows across his weathered face. She could not read his expression at this distance, but she felt the weight of his decision pressing down upon her. Had he truly believed this was best for her, or merely advantageous for his business? The question burned in her mind as she urged her mare forward, following Swift Arrow's lead into the vast, star-studded darkness of the Arizona night. The Apache warrior rode slightly ahead, his straight back and proud posture a silhouette against the lightening eastern horizon. By sunrise, you'll be in my camp, he said over his shoulder. The beginning of your new life, Elizabeth Foster. Elizabeth squared her shoulders, determination settling over her like armor. For 1 month only, she reminded him, a voice stronger than she felt. After that, we shall see. Swift Arrow did not respond, but in the growing light, she thought she detected the faintest smile on his stern face. The Apache camp was nothing like Elizabeth had imagined. Instead of the primitive collection of teepees depicted in the dime novels she'd secretly read, she found a complex arrangement of wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings covered with brush and grass, organized in family groups. Women moved purposefully about morning tasks, children ran playing between dwellings, and men gathered in small groups, some dressed in traditional garments, others in a mixture of Apache and white man's clothing. All activity ceased as Swift Arrow led Elizabeth into the camp. Dozens of eyes turned to assess the white woman riding beside their respected warrior. Elizabeth felt exposed under their scrutiny, but forced herself to sit tall in the saddle. Swift Arrow had warned her during their journey, Show weakness, and they will never respect you. Show arrogance, and they will never accept you. It was a difficult balance to maintain under the weight of so many curious and suspicious gazes. An elderly woman stepped forward, her face a map of wrinkles, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence. She spoke rapidly to Swift Arrow in Apache, her gaze never leaving Elizabeth's face. Swift Arrow responded respectfully, then turned to Elizabeth. "This is Laughing Bird, my grandmother. She welcomes you to our camp, but wonders why you look so frightened when no one has threatened you." Elizabeth swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. The truth was that everything about this situation terrified her. The strangeness, the uncertainty, the loss of control over her own fate. But admitting fear seemed unwise. "Please tell your grandmother that I am not afraid, merely respectful of being in a new place among new people," she said carefully. Swift Arrow's eyes gleamed with what might have been approval as he translated. The old woman listened, then laughed, a surprisingly musical sound from such a weathered frame. She spoke again, gesturing animatedly. "She says you lie well for a white woman, but your eyes cannot hide your fear," Swift Arrow translated, amusement evident in his voice. "She says this is good. Only fools feel no fear in strange places." Laughing Bird approached Elizabeth's horse and looked up at her. With gnarled fingers, she beckoned Elizabeth to dismount. After a moment's hesitation and a glance at Swift Arrow, who nodded encouragingly, Elizabeth slid from her saddle. The old woman circled her slowly, examining everything from her riding boots to her hastily braided hair. Finally, she reached out and took Elizabeth's hands, turning them palm up. Laughing Bird studied Elizabeth's palms intently, running her thumbs over the soft skin. She spoke again to Swift Arrow, her tone thoughtful. "She says your hands are soft like a child's. You must learn to work if you are to survive here," he translated. The old woman released Elizabeth's hands and looked directly into her eyes. Her next words were delivered with evident feeling. Swift Arrow hesitated before translating. "She says you have fire in your spirit. This is good. My grandson needs a woman who will stand against him when he is wrong, not just a shadow who follows without question." Elizabeth was startled by this assessment, and even more by the implication that Laughing Bird approved of her as a match for Swift Arrow. Before she could formulate a response, Laughing Bird turned away, calling out to a young woman who approached quickly. More rapid Apache followed, and then Swift Arrow explained. "My cousin Morning Star will show you to the dwelling where you will stay. It belongs to my sister, who is visiting another camp. You will rest, then join us for the evening meal." Elizabeth wanted to protest, to remind Swift Arrow that she was merely a guest, not a bride-to-be being welcomed into the family. But exhaustion from their overnight journey washed over her. The thought of rest was too appealing to resist. She followed Morning Star, a slender young woman, perhaps a few years younger than herself, to a wickiup set slightly apart from the others. The young Apache woman gestured for Elizabeth to enter, then followed her inside. The dwelling was surprisingly spacious within, with sleeping pallets arranged around the edges and various belongings stored neatly. Morning Star pointed to a pallet covered with soft-looking furs and spoke words Elizabeth couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. This would be her bed. The young woman mimed washing, pointed to a ceramic bowl of water, then eating, and held up 5 fingers, presumably to indicate when food would be available. Elizabeth nodded her understanding, grateful for the universal language of gestures. When Morning Star left, Elizabeth sank onto the pallet, her body aching from the long ride. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Elizabeth as her mind raced with the events of the past hours. How had her carefully planned escape led her here, to the heart of an Apache camp? What would the coming month bring? And what of Swift Arrow, this proud, intelligent man, who seemed determined to make her his wife, yet offered her a choice no other man had? These questions chased each other through her thoughts, until finally, fatigue claimed her, and she drifted into an uneasy slumber, filled with dreams of desert landscapes and dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. When she awoke, the quality of light filtering through the wickiup told her it was late afternoon. Someone, Morning Star, she presumed, had left a ceramic jug of water and clean cloths beside her pallet. Elizabeth gratefully washed the dust of travel from her face and hands, then did her best to make herself presentable. Her riding clothes were rumpled from sleep, but she had nothing else. She'd packed lightly for her escape, planning to purchase necessities in Santa Fe. Now she wondered what she would wear for a month among the Apache. As if in answer to her unspoken question, the wickiup's entrance flap lifted, and Morning Star entered, carrying a bundle of clothing. The young woman smiled shyly as she laid the garments on Elizabeth's pallet. Through gestures and the few English words Morning Star knew, Elizabeth understood these clothes were for her. The Apache woman indicated Elizabeth should change, then slipped outside to wait. Alone again, Elizabeth examined the offering, a simple dress of soft tan deerskin, decorated with subtle beadwork along the neckline, and soft moccasins to replace her impractical riding boots. The garments were beautiful in their simplicity, clearly made with skill and care. Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before changing. The deerskin felt strange against her skin, softer than she'd expected, and surprisingly comfortable in the desert heat. When she emerged from the wickiup, Morning Star's approving smile told Elizabeth the clothes suited her well. The young Apache woman guided Elizabeth through the camp toward a central area where people were gathering. All conversation stopped momentarily as Elizabeth approached. She felt the weight of dozens of assessing gazes, some curious, others openly hostile. Swift Arrow stepped forward from a group of men, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of Elizabeth in Apache clothing. For a moment, something like appreciation flashed across his usually stoic features. "You honor our people by wearing our garments," he said quietly, just for her ears. Before Elizabeth could respond, an older man approached, gray-haired but straight-backed, with an air of authority that commanded respect. Swift Arrow straightened perceptibly. "This is Chief Running Wolf, leader of our band," he explained. The chief studied Elizabeth with keen eyes that missed nothing. He spoke to Swift Arrow, his tone measured but intense. Swift Arrow listened respectfully, then replied at length in Apache. Elizabeth stood perfectly still, wishing she could understand what was being said about her. Finally, Swift Arrow turned to translate. "The chief welcomes you as my guest. He says your presence here shows courage, but he wonders if you understand what your father has agreed to." Elizabeth lifted her chin slightly. "Please tell the chief that my father made this arrangement without my consent. I am here to learn about your people before I decide whether to honor his agreement." Swift Arrow's eyebrows rose marginally at her boldness, but he translated her words faithfully. Chief Running Wolf's weathered face remained impassive as he listened, but a gleam of interest appeared in his dark eyes. He responded with what sounded like a question. "He asks why a daughter would not honor her father's word," Swift Arrow translated. Elizabeth took a deep breath. Because in my culture, a woman has the right to choose her own husband, or at least she should. I meant no disrespect to my father or to your people, but I cannot agree to marry someone I do not know. After Swift Arrow translated, a murmur ran through the gathered Apache. The chief's expression remained unreadable as he considered her words. Finally, he spoke again, this time at greater length. Chief Running Wolf says your honesty is refreshing, if surprising, Swift Arrow translated. He says that among our people, marriages are often arranged, but both families must agree. He understands your desire to know more before deciding. The chief spoke again, more forcefully this time. Swift Arrow's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he translated. He also says that while you are here, you will live as Apache women live, working, learning our ways. You will not be a guest who sits idle. Elizabeth nodded, relieved that the chief hadn't dismissed her outright. I am willing to work and learn, she said sincerely. After this exchange was translated, the chief gave a short nod of approval, then turned away to speak with other tribe members. Swift Arrow guided Elizabeth to where food was being served, a rich stew of rabbit and wild vegetables that smelled far better than Elizabeth had expected. As they ate, seated on woven mats around small cook-fires, Swift Arrow explained aspects of Apache life. Elizabeth listened attentively, finding herself genuinely interested despite her circumstances. Tomorrow you will begin working with the women, Swift Arrow told her as the meal concluded. My grandmother has agreed to instruct you. Elizabeth set down her wooden bowl. And what exactly will I be learning? Swift Arrow's eyes held a hint of challenge. Everything an Apache woman must know: preparing food, tanning hides, gathering plants for medicine and food, weaving baskets. He paused. It will not be easy for hands that have known only the soft work of a trading post. Elizabeth bristled at his assumption. My hands may be softer than those of Apache women, but I am no stranger to hard work, Swift Arrow. My father didn't hire help at the trading post. I kept the books, stocked the shelves, and served customers from dawn until dusk. Swift Arrow inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words. Then perhaps you will surprise us all, Elizabeth Foster. As darkness fell over the camp, fires burned brighter and several older men began to tell stories. Though Elizabeth couldn't understand the words, the rhythm and cadence of their voices created a hypnotic effect. Swift Arrow translated portions for her, tales of the people's creation, of great hunts and battles, of trickster animals and wise ancestors. For the first time since her arrival, Elizabeth felt herself relaxing, drawn into the rich cultural tapestry being woven around her. Later, as Swift Arrow walked her back to her wickiup, Elizabeth gathered her courage to ask the question that had been bothering her since their arrival. Where will you sleep? She asked bluntly. In the firelight, she saw amusement flicker across his face. I have my own dwelling, Elizabeth Foster. Did you think I would break my word so quickly? She flushed, embarrassed by her assumption, yet relieved by his answer. I wasn't sure what to expect, she admitted. They stopped outside her temporary home. Swift Arrow studied her face in the moonlight. You have survived your first day among the people, he observed, and you have not run away. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. The month has only just begun, Swift Arrow. Don't mistake temporary acceptance for surrender. His soft laugh surprised her. It was a warm, rich sound she hadn't heard from him before. I would expect nothing less from you, Elizabeth Foster. Sleep well. Tomorrow, your real education begins. True to Swift Arrow's warning, Elizabeth's education began well before dawn the next morning. Laughing Bird arrived at her wickiup while the stars still shone brightly overhead, rousing her with firm but gentle hands. The old woman handed Elizabeth a clay cup of some bitter herbal tea, miming that she should drink it quickly. Still groggy, Elizabeth complied, wincing at the taste, but appreciating the warmth that spread through her body. Through a combination of gestures, the few English words Laughing Bird knew, and sheer determination, the old woman made it clear that Elizabeth would be joining the women in their morning tasks. Outside, the camp was already stirring to life. Women moved purposely about their duties, stoking cooking fires and preparing morning meals. Children helped with simple tasks or played quietly. Men gathered their weapons for hunting or tended to horses. Elizabeth followed Laughing Bird to where a group of women were grinding corn between stones. The technique looked simple enough, but when Elizabeth tried to mimic their actions, her results were clumsy at best. The corn scattered, and her hands quickly developed painful blisters. Some of the younger women giggled behind their hands, but Laughing Bird silenced them with a sharp word. The old woman demonstrated again, her gnarled hands moving with practiced efficiency despite her age. Elizabeth tried once more, determined to master this basic skill. By the time the sun had fully risen, she had produced a small amount of coarse cornmeal, though nowhere near what the Apache women had accomplished in the same time. Her hands were raw and aching, but a sense of accomplishment warmed her chest when Laughing Bird nodded approvingly at her efforts. The morning continued with more lessons: how to tend the cook fire without wasting precious wood, how to recognize which plants were safe to eat, how to carry water in woven containers sealed with pine pitch. By midday, Elizabeth's muscles screamed with fatigue, and her elegant riding clothes, which she had changed back into for work, were filthy. Yet she refused to complain or ask for rest, sensing that her willingness to work was being carefully evaluated by the entire community. During a brief respite, while they ate a simple meal of corn cakes and dried berries, Morning Star approached with a small pot of salve. With gentle fingers, she applied the cooling mixture to Elizabeth's blistered hands. "Thank you," Elizabeth said sincerely. Morning Star smiled shyly. "You work good," she said in halting English. "Not cry like white woman." Elizabeth couldn't help but laugh. "I'm still a white woman, even if I don't cry," she pointed out. Morning Star's brow furrowed as she worked to understand. Then she, too, laughed. Yes, this simple exchange, brief as it was, lifted Elizabeth's spirits. Perhaps building bridges between their worlds wasn't impossible after all. The afternoon brought new tasks. Laughing Bird took Elizabeth to the edge of a stream that ran near the camp, where several women were washing hides and stretching them on wooden frames. The process was fascinating, despite its obvious difficulty and the unpleasant smells involved. Elizabeth watched carefully, then joined in when invited, determined to prove herself capable. The women worked mostly in silence, but occasionally one would speak to another, sometimes casting glances in Elizabeth's direction. She wondered what they were saying about her, whether they resented her presence or merely found it curious. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Elizabeth spotted Swift Arrow returning with a hunting party. The men carried several deer, their successful hunt evident in their proud bearing. Swift Arrow's gaze swept the camp until it found Elizabeth by the stream. Even at a distance, she felt the intensity of his dark eyes as they assessed her. Dirty, tired, but still working alongside his people. He gave her a slight nod that felt strangely like approval before turning to help the other hunters prepare their bounty. That evening, the camp celebrated the successful hunt with a feast. Elizabeth, exhausted from her day of labor, found herself seated near Swift Arrow as portions of the freshly roasted venison were distributed. "You worked hard today," he observed, his tone neutral, but his eyes watchful. Elizabeth flexed her sore hands. "Your grandmother is a demanding teacher," she replied, "but a good one." Swift Arrow's mouth curved slightly. "She says you learn quickly for a white woman." Elizabeth wasn't sure whether to be flattered or offended by this backhanded compliment. "And what do you think, Swift Arrow? Am I meeting your expectations?" The warrior studied her face for a long moment before responding. "You surprise me, Elizabeth Foster. I expected resistance, perhaps even attempts to escape. Instead, you embrace the challenge." Elizabeth picked at her food, considering her response carefully. "I agreed to 1 month of learning about your people. I intend to honor that agreement." She met his gaze directly. "But don't mistake my willingness to learn for acceptance of our arrangement." Swift Arrow's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps respect, perhaps amusement. 29 more days, he reminded her. Then you decide. After the meal, as the camp settled for the night, Elizabeth made her way back to her wickiup alone. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could ache, and exhaustion pulled at her like a physical weight. Yet as she lay on her pallet in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar night sounds of the Apache camp, she found herself reflecting on the day with unexpected satisfaction. She had survived, had even begun to learn. Perhaps this month would not be the ordeal she had feared. Days turned into weeks as Elizabeth settled into the rhythm of Apache life. Each morning brought new lessons: basket weaving, hide preparation, food preservation, medicinal plants. Her hands hardened, developing calluses where blisters had once formed. Her skin darkened under the relentless Arizona sun, and her body grew stronger from the constant physical labor. More surprising than these physical changes were the bonds she began to form. Laughing Bird's gruff instruction gradually softened into something like mentorship. Morning Star became a friend of sorts, their communication improving daily as Elizabeth learned basic Apache words and Morning Star practiced her limited English. Even some of the women who had initially regarded her with suspicion began to include her in their conversations, using gestures and patience to bridge the language gap. Swift Arrow maintained a careful distance during this time, watching her integration into camp life but rarely interfering. When their paths crossed, he would inquire about her progress, or explain some aspect of Apache culture she had observed but not understood. These brief interactions were unfailingly polite, even respectful, but Elizabeth sensed he was deliberately giving her space to form her own impressions of his people without his influence. 15 days into her stay, everything changed. Elizabeth was returning from the stream with a group of women carrying freshly washed hides when shouts erupted from the perimeter of the camp. Men rushed toward their weapons as women quickly gathered children and moved toward the center of the settlement. Caught in the sudden chaos, Elizabeth froze, uncertain what was happening. Swift Arrow appeared at her side, his expression grave. "Renegade white men. They've been raiding isolated farms and blaming it on the Apache," he explained tersely. "Now they've followed our hunting party back to camp." He grasped her arm. "Come, you must get to safety." Elizabeth allowed him to guide her toward Laughing Bird's wickiup, where other women and children were gathering. "Why would they attack you if they know I'm here?" she asked, struggling to understand. "Wouldn't my presence prove the Apache aren't responsible for the raids?" Swift Arrow's jaw tightened. "These men don't seek proof or justice, Elizabeth. They seek excuses for violence. Your presence would not stop them. It might even endanger you further." Before she could respond, gunfire cracked through the air. Swift Arrow pushed Elizabeth roughly behind him, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. Through the gap between wickiups, Elizabeth could see riders circling the camp's perimeter, firing indiscriminately. Apache warriors returned fire from defensive positions, their accuracy forcing the attackers to keep their distance. "Stay here," Swift Arrow commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. He moved to join the defense, his movements swift and purposeful. Elizabeth huddled with the women and children, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. Laughing Bird sat stoically nearby, murmuring what sounded like prayers or perhaps ancient warrior chants. The old woman's quiet strength steadied Elizabeth, helping her control her rising panic. The attack lasted less than 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. The renegades, facing unexpected resistance and taking several casualties, finally retreated into the desert. As the sounds of gunfire faded, a new kind of chaos erupted. Wounded needed tending, damage needed assessment, and sentries needed posting in case the attackers returned. Elizabeth emerged from the wickiup to find Swift Arrow organizing the camp's response. His left arm was wrapped in a hasty bandage, blood seeping through the cloth. Without thinking, she hurried to his side. "You're injured," she said, reaching for his arm. He shook his head, dismissing her concern. "Others are worse. Help the women tend to them." Swallowing her protest, Elizabeth nodded and moved to where women were already caring for the wounded. Her father's trading post had often served as an informal medical station. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away, and Elizabeth had learned basic wound treatment out of necessity. Now, she worked alongside Apache women, cleaning injuries, applying medicinal poultices, and bandaging wounds. 2 warriors had been killed in the attack, and several others seriously wounded. As night fell, a somber mood settled over the camp. The bodies of the fallen were prepared for burial according to Apache customs, while families gathered to comfort one another. Elizabeth found Swift Arrow seated alone at the edge of the camp, his face illuminated by moonlight, his injured arm now properly bandaged. She approached hesitantly, unsure of her welcome. "May I join you?" she asked softly. He looked up, surprise briefly crossing his features before he nodded. Elizabeth sat beside him on the hard-packed earth, careful to maintain a respectful distance. For several minutes, they sat in silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. Finally, Swift Arrow spoke. 3 of the attackers were killed. The rest escaped. His voice was tight with controlled anger. "They will tell stories in the white settlements about savage Apache attacks, and none will question their lies." Elizabeth felt shame wash over her at the truth of his words. How often had she heard such tales at the trading post, accepting them without question? "I'm sorry," she said simply, knowing the words were inadequate. Swift Arrow turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting starlight. "Why do you apologize? You did not attack us." Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "I'm sorry because I never questioned the stories. Because I believed what was convenient to believe." Something shifted in Swift Arrow's expression, a softening around his eyes, a lessening of the rigid control he typically maintained. "You see now with your own eyes. That is more than most of your people would do." They lapsed into silence again, but it was a different quality of silence, contemplative rather than tense. Elizabeth found herself studying Swift Arrow's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the proud set of his shoulders, even in exhaustion. For the first time, she saw him not as her captor or an arranged husband, but as a man bearing the weight of leadership in impossible circumstances, trying to protect his people in a world increasingly hostile to their very existence. "Why did you really arrange this marriage with my father?" she asked suddenly. There must have been easier alliances to forge. Swift Arrow didn't answer immediately, his gaze still fixed on the distant horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and reflective. "Your father is respected by both whites and Apache. His trading post is neutral ground. A connection to his family gives my people possibilities." Elizabeth waited, sensing there was more. Swift Arrow continued, his words measured. "But there were other reasons. I have watched you for many months, Elizabeth Foster. I have seen your kindness to those who enter the trading post, white, Mexican, Indian. I have seen your intelligence, your strength when faced with difficult customers." He turned to face her fully. "The world is changing. My people must find new paths forward or be destroyed. I need a partner who understands both worlds, who has the courage to walk between them." His honesty surprised her, as did the implicit respect in his assessment. "You speak as if you know me," she said, "yet we've barely exchanged more than a few sentences before this month." A faint smile touched Swift Arrow's lips. "I observe carefully before I act, Elizabeth Foster. It is how I have survived." He glanced toward the camp, where families were settling for the night, the community drawing together in the aftermath of violence. "And how I hope my people will survive." In the days that followed the attack, Elizabeth noticed subtle changes in how the Apache regarded her. Where there had been tolerance tinged with suspicion, there was now a tentative acceptance. She had stayed when she could have fled during the chaos. She had tended their wounded without hesitation. Most significantly, she had not blamed them or defended the white attackers. These actions spoke louder than any words could have. Elizabeth found herself drawn more deeply into the daily life of the camp. Laughing Bird began teaching her Apache words more systematically, grunting with approval when Elizabeth mastered difficult pronunciations. Morning Star and other young women invited her to join their social gatherings, where they shared stories and laughter while working on beadwork or other crafts. Even Chief Running Wolf acknowledged her with a solemn nod when their paths crossed. Only her relationship with Swift Arrow remained ambiguous. Since the night of the attack, their interactions had been marked by a new awareness, a charged undercurrent that Elizabeth wasn't quite ready to examine. He continued to maintain a respectful distance, but his dark eyes followed her movements around the camp with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite herself. 23 days into her stay, Elizabeth realized with a start that she was no longer counting the days until she could leave. The thought both frightened and intrigued her. Had she truly begun to find a place among these people whom she had once considered so alien? Or was she simply adapting to survive, as humans had always done? That evening, as she sat with Morning Star and other young women learning to create intricate beaded patterns, Swift Arrow approached their circle. The women fell silent, exchanging knowing glances that made Elizabeth self-conscious. "Would you walk with me, Elizabeth?" Swift Arrow asked, his formal tone belied by the warmth in his eyes. Aware of the interested gazes following them, Elizabeth set aside her beadwork and rose to join him. They walked in companionable silence to the edge of the camp, where the desert stretched vast and mysterious under the setting sun. "Tomorrow, I must lead a hunting party into the mountains," Swift Arrow said finally. "We will be gone for 3 days." Elizabeth nodded, unsure why he was telling her this or why the news created an unexpected, hollow feeling in her chest. "The camp will be safe," he continued. "Chief Running Wolf and the other warriors will remain." He turned to face her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "When I return, there will be only 4 days remaining of your promised month." Elizabeth's breath caught at the reminder. The deadline that had once seemed her salvation now loomed with unexpected complexity. "Yes," she managed. 4 days." Swift Arrow studied her face intently. "You are different than when you arrived, Elizabeth Foster." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes, I understand many things now that I didn't before." She looked out at the desert, gathering her thoughts. "Your people have been kind to me, despite having every reason not to trust a white woman. I've learned much from them." Swift Arrow stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body in the cooling evening air. "And what have you learned about me?" he asked quietly. The directness of his question startled her. Elizabeth looked up at him, at the proud features that had become familiar over these weeks. "I've learned that you are a man of honor," she said truthfully, "that you care deeply for your people and will do whatever is necessary to protect them, that you see further into the future than most men, white or Apache." She hesitated, then added, "And that you have been patient with a stubborn white woman who didn't understand what she was being offered." Something like a smile touched Swift Arrow's lips. "You are still stubborn, Elizabeth Foster, but now your stubbornness is directed toward learning our ways, not fighting against them." He reached out slowly, as if giving her time to withdraw, and touched a strand of hair that had escaped her braid. The simple contact sent warmth cascading through her. "When I return, we will speak of your decision," he said, his voice deep and resonant in the gathering twilight. "Until then, think of what you truly want, not what you are running from, but what you might be running toward." The hunting party departed at dawn the next morning. Elizabeth rose early to watch them leave, her eyes finding Swift Arrow automatically among the mounted warriors. He rode with confident ease, his tall figure straight and proud in the saddle. As if sensing her gaze, he turned as the party reached the edge of the camp. Their eyes met across the distance, a moment of connection that needed no words. Then he was gone, disappearing into the rugged landscape with his fellow hunters. The following 3 days passed with agonizing slowness for Elizabeth. She threw herself into her tasks with renewed vigor, determined to master as many skills as possible. Before what? The question haunted her. When the month ended, what would she choose? Return to the white world that now seemed narrow and prejudiced after all she had seen? Or remain with the Apache, with Swift Arrow, embracing a life so different from anything she had known before? On the evening of the 3rd day, Elizabeth sat alone by the stream, watching the water flow over smooth stones. The decision before her seemed equally fluid, changing shape as she examined it from different angles. A sound behind her made Elizabeth turn. Laughing Bird approached, her movements slower than usual after a day of hard work. The old woman eased herself down beside Elizabeth, groaning softly as her aging joints protested. For several minutes, they sat in companionable silence. Then Laughing Bird spoke, her voice weathered but strong. "You think too much," she said in her limited English, tapping her temple. "Listen here instead." She placed her hand over her heart. Elizabeth smiled at the simple wisdom. "It's not that easy," she replied, unsure how much Laughing Bird would understand. The old woman snorted. "Always easy. Yes or no. Stay or go. Life or death." She fixed Elizabeth with her penetrating gaze. "You already know answer. Just afraid." Before Elizabeth could respond, shouts erupted from the direction of the camp. They turned to see a rider approaching at full gallop. One of the hunting party, his horse lathered with sweat. Laughing Bird rose with surprising speed, her face creased with concern. Elizabeth followed as they hurried back to the camp. The messenger delivered his news to Chief Running Wolf in rapid Apache, his gestures urgent. A crowd gathered quickly, tension spreading through the camp. Elizabeth pushed her way forward, desperate to understand what was happening. She caught Morningstar's arm. "What is it? What's wrong?" The young woman's face was drawn with worry. "Hunting party attacked," she explained in halting English. "White men, many hurt. Swift arrow." She made a gesture that needed no translation. Wounded or dead. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. "Where are they?" she demanded. "How far?" Morningstar pointed northwest. 2 hours ride. Bad Canyon. Without hesitation, Elizabeth turned toward the horses. Chief Running Wolf was already organizing a rescue party, selecting warriors to accompany him. Elizabeth approached him directly, ignoring the murmurs her boldness caused. "I'm coming with you," she stated, meeting his gaze steadily. The chief began to shake his head, but Elizabeth pressed on. "I can help with the wounded, and if there are white men involved, I may be able to prevent more bloodshed." Chief Running Wolf studied her for a long moment, weighing her words. Finally, he gave a short nod of agreement. "Ride," he said simply in English. Within minutes, Elizabeth was mounted on her mare, riding hard alongside 10 Apache warriors. The chief set a punishing pace, and Elizabeth was grateful for all she had learned about riding from watching the Apache these past weeks. As they rode, she prayed to a god she wasn't sure she still believed in, prayed that Swift Arrow was alive, that they would reach the hunting party in time. The landscape grew increasingly rugged as they followed a narrow trail into a maze of canyons. The chief raised his hand, signaling caution. They proceeded more slowly now, alert for any sign of danger. Around a sharp bend in the canyon, they found the hunting party. The scene was one of organized chaos, wounded men being tended by their companions, horses being calmed, weapons at the ready. Elizabeth's eyes scanned desperately for Swift Arrow. She spotted him leaning against a boulder, his chest bound with a bloody bandage, his face drawn with pain, but very much alive. Relief crashed through her with such force that she nearly fell from her horse. She dismounted quickly and rushed to his side, heedless of propriety or protocol. Swift Arrow looked up in surprise as she knelt beside him. "Elizabeth?" His voice was weak but clear. "What are you doing here?" She was already examining his wound, gently lifting the makeshift bandage. "Saving your life, apparently," she replied, striving for a lightness she didn't feel. The injury was serious, a bullet wound to his upper chest that had mercifully missed his heart, but had caused significant blood loss. "I need clean water and fresh bandages," she called out in English, then repeated her request in the few Apache words she knew. Warriors moved quickly to comply, recognizing the authority in her voice. As she worked to clean and rebind Swift Arrow's wound, Elizabeth heard Chief Running Wolf speaking with the other hunters, piecing together what had happened. The hunting party had encountered the same band of renegade whites who had attacked the camp. Outnumbered, The Apache had been forced to take refuge in the canyon. "They're still out there," Swift Arrow told her, wincing as she tightened the fresh bandage. "Waiting. They know the camp sent help." Elizabeth's hands stilled as she absorbed this information. They were trapped in the canyon, with wounded men who needed proper care. And somewhere beyond the narrow walls, armed men waited to continue their violence. "How many?" she asked. "Perhaps 10 or 12, Swift Arrow replied. "We killed 3 before retreating here." Elizabeth finished securing his bandage, her mind racing. An idea, dangerous, perhaps foolish, was forming. "I need to speak with Chief Running Wolf," she said. Swift Arrow caught her wrist as she started to rise. "What are you thinking, Elizabeth?" His dark eyes searched her face, concern evident in his gaze. "Something that might save us all," she answered honestly. "But you won't like it." Before he could protest, she pulled away gently and approached the chief. In halting Apache supplemented with gestures and the few English words he knew, Elizabeth outlined her plan. The chief listened, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Too dangerous," he said finally in English, shaking his head. "They kill you." Elizabeth stood her ground. "They might, but they might also listen to a white woman. If I can convince them that I'm here willingly, that the Apache have been falsely blamed for rapes," she gestured toward the wounded men. "What other choice do we have? Night is coming. The wounded need better care than they can receive here." The chief was silent for a long moment, weighing her words against his better judgment. Finally, he gave a reluctant nod. "You try, we watch." Elizabeth returned to Swift Arrow, who had gathered enough strength to sit up straighter, his face dark with disapproval. "Running Wolf told me your plan," he said, his voice stronger than before, but tight with anger. "It is foolishness. These men do not seek truth or justice." Elizabeth knelt beside him again. "Perhaps not, but they might hesitate to shoot a white woman. That hesitation could be enough." She held his gaze steadily. "I have to try, Swift Arrow, for all of us." Something shifted in his expression, pride mingling with fear for her safety. "You have become more Apache than you know," he said softly. Elizabeth felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. Impulsively, she leaned forward and pressed her lips briefly to his. The kiss was gentle but filled with promise. "For luck," she whispered as she pulled away, surprised by her own boldness. Swift Arrow's eyes widened, then softened with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. "Return to me, Elizabeth Foster," he said, his voice a command and a prayer. She nodded once, then rose and moved toward her horse. The plan was simple, but dangerous. She would ride out alone, under a white flag, and attempt to parley with the renegades. If she could convince them that she was Samuel Foster's daughter, that she was with the Apache by choice, perhaps she could create enough doubt to allow the hunting party safe passage back to camp. Chief Running Wolf provided her with a white cloth to use as a flag of truce. As Elizabeth mounted her mare, the entire hunting party and rescue team watched in silence, their faces solemn. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves, then urged her horse forward toward the mouth of the canyon. The sun was setting as Elizabeth emerged from the canyon's shelter, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. She held the white cloth high, making herself as visible as possible as she rode slowly forward. "Hello, the camp," she called out, her voice carrying across the stillness. "I'm Elizabeth Foster, daughter of Samuel Foster, who runs the trading post at Coyote Springs. I come to talk under flag of truce." For several tense moments, there was no response. Then a voice called back from behind a cluster of rocks. "Come forward slow, hands where we can see 'em." Elizabeth complied, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. As she approached, several men emerged from cover, rifles trained on her. Their leader, a burly man with a graying beard and cold eyes, stepped forward. "Foster's daughter, you say? What in tarnation are you doing with a bunch of murdering Apaches?" Elizabeth sat tall in her saddle, meeting his hostile gaze without flinching. "I'm with the Apache by choice, sir, and they are not murderers. The raids you blame on them are being carried out by others, perhaps even men in your own company." The leader's face darkened with anger. "That's a damned lie. We've seen the evidence with our own eyes." Elizabeth shook her head firmly. "What you've seen is what someone wanted you to see. I've been living with this band for nearly a month. They haven't raided any settlements." She gestured toward the canyon. "Right now, there are wounded men back there who need medical attention. Good men who were hunting to feed their families when you attacked them without provocation." The leader spat on the ground. "Without provocation? They killed 3 of my men." Elizabeth held his gaze steadily. "After you fired on them first, I'd wager. Just as you did when you attacked their camp 2 weeks ago." A murmur ran through the group of renegades. One of the men stepped forward. "How do we know you ain't being forced to say this? Maybe they're holding you hostage." Elizabeth shook her head. "My father arranged for me to stay with the Apache to learn their ways. You can verify this with him at the trading post." The leader studied her suspiciously. "Samuel Foster wouldn't give his daughter to savages. I know the man." Elizabeth felt anger flare within her at his dismissive tone and the slur against the Apache. "You clearly don't know him as well as you think, and these people are not savages. They have shown me more honor and hospitality than I'm seeing from you right now." She straightened in her saddle. "I'm asking you to let us pass peacefully. There's been enough bloodshed on both sides." The men exchanged uncertain glances. Elizabeth pressed her advantage. "If you continue this fight, word will spread to Fort Bowie about who really started it. My father has the ear of the commander there. Do you want the army investigating your actions?" This was a bluff. Her father had no special relationship with the fort's commander, but she delivered it with convincing authority. The leader's confidence visibly wavered. After a long, tense moment, he lowered his rifle slightly. "Get your engines and clear out, but this ain't over, not by a long shot." Elizabeth nodded curtly, not trusting herself to speak further without revealing her relief. She turned her horse and rode back to the canyon, where anxious eyes watched for her return. "They've agreed to let us pass," she announced as she reached the waiting Apache. "We should move quickly, before they change their minds." Chief Running Wolf organized the wounded onto horses, with stronger warriors supporting those too weak to ride alone. Swift Arrow insisted on riding by himself, though Elizabeth could see the effort cost him dearly. As the combined hunting and rescue parties emerged from the canyon, the renegades stood watching from a ridge, rifles still at the ready, but pointed downward. The tension was palpable as the Apache riders passed within range of the white men's guns. Elizabeth rode at the front beside Chief Running Wolf, her head held high, her presence a living shield for the people, who had become, against all odds, her people too. Only when they were well beyond rifle range did Elizabeth allow herself to breathe normally again. The journey back to camp was slow and careful, with frequent stops to check on the wounded. Swift Arrow grew progressively weaker, the blood loss and exertion taking their toll. By the time they reached the outskirts of the Apache settlement, he was barely conscious, slumped forward over his horse's neck. Elizabeth rode close beside him, ready to catch him if he fell. The camp erupted in activity as they arrived, women rushing forward to help with the wounded, children sent to fetch water and medical supplies. Warriors, positioned as sentries in case the renegades decided to follow. Laughing Bird took charge of Swift Arrow's care, directing young men to carry him to his wickiup, while she gathered her most potent medicines. Elizabeth followed anxiously, unwilling to leave his side. The old woman worked efficiently, cleaning the wound more thoroughly, applying poultices of herbs and chanting softly as she worked. Elizabeth assisted silently, handing Laughing Bird what she needed without being asked, her heart constricting at Swift Arrow's pallor and shallow breathing. "He is strong," Laughing Bird said finally, patting Elizabeth's hand. "We'll live." Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. The old woman studied her face knowingly. "You stay. Watch over." With that, she left the wickiup, leaving Elizabeth alone with the unconscious warrior. Swift Arrow's dwelling was larger than Elizabeth's temporary home, with evidence of his status throughout. Finely crafted weapons, a decorated shield, a chief's headdress that must have belonged to his father or grandfather. Elizabeth settled beside his sleeping pallet, gently bathing his face with cool water to combat the fever that had begun to rise. As night deepened around them, she maintained her vigil, periodically changing the poultices and offering small sips of water whenever he stirred. Sometime near dawn, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into sleep, her hands still clasping his. She woke to the sensation of fingers gently stroking her hair. Opening her eyes, she found Swift Arrow awake, his gaze clear and alert, despite the pain lines around his eyes. "You saved us all," he said softly. Elizabeth sat up, quickly checking his bandages and feeling his forehead for fever. The heat had diminished significantly, a good sign. "We saved each other," she corrected, relief making her voice unsteady. Swift Arrow's hand moved to cup her cheek. "You could have died, Elizabeth." She leaned into his touch, no longer fighting the feelings that had grown steadily throughout her time with the Apache. "So could you, so could all of us." She managed a small smile. "But we didn't. We survived, Swift Arrow. Together." Something profound passed between them in that moment, an understanding that transcended words or cultural differences. It was the bridge Elizabeth had never expected to find, connecting her world to his across a chasm of misunderstanding and prejudice. "The month is nearly over," Swift Arrow said after a moment, his voice carefully neutral, despite the question in his eyes. "2 more days." Elizabeth took a deep breath, suddenly certain of the decision she had been struggling with for weeks. "I already know my answer," she said softly. Swift Arrow's eyes never left hers. "And what is your decision, Elizabeth Foster?" Elizabeth smiled, feeling a sense of rightness settle over her. "My decision is that I don't want to be Elizabeth Foster anymore," she said. "I want to be Elizabeth who lives among the people, who learns their ways, who shares their struggles and joys." She paused, gathering her courage. "I want to be your wife, Swift Arrow, not because my father arranged it, but because I choose it." The transformation of Swift Arrow's face was like watching the sun break through storm clouds, his usually stoic features softening with joy and wonder. He pulled her gently toward him, mindful of his wound. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice a whisper against her hair. "The path will not be easy. You will be between worlds, belonging fully to neither." Elizabeth nodded against his chest. "I'm certain. Some paths are difficult because they're worth walking." She lifted her head to meet his gaze. "And I won't be alone on this path. We'll walk it together." 3 days later, when Swift Arrow had regained enough strength to stand, they were married according to Apache tradition, in a ceremony that blended ancient customs with new beginnings. Elizabeth wore a wedding dress of soft white deerskin, elaborately beaded by the women of the camp, who had come to accept her as one of their own. Swift Arrow stood tall and proud beside her, his dark eyes never leaving her face, as they spoke the promises that would bind them together. Chief Running Wolf conducted the ceremony, his weathered voice carrying across the hushed gathering as he called upon the spirits to bless their union. Laughing Bird wept openly. Tears of joy, she insisted, for the future she could now envision for her grandson and his children. After the ceremony, as the camp celebrated with feasting and dancing, a rider approached from the direction of Coyote Springs. Elizabeth recognized one of her father's ranch hands, Tom Wilson, a kind-hearted young man who had often helped at the trading post. He carried a letter from Samuel Foster, expressing both concern for his daughter's prolonged absence and hope that she had found what she was seeking among the Apache. With Swift Arrow at her side, Elizabeth penned a reply, explaining her decision to stay, inviting her father to visit the camp, and suggesting ways they might strengthen the alliance between the trading post and the Apache band. As Tom prepared to depart with the message, Elizabeth added one final note. "Tell my father that I am not lost to him. I have simply found a wider world than either of us imagined possible." In the weeks that followed, word spread through the territory of the white woman who had married an Apache warrior by choice. Some settlers condemned her decision as a betrayal of her race. Others viewed it with curious fascination. A few, those with visions similar to Samuel Foster's, recognized it as a small but significant step toward a different future, one where understanding might eventually replace fear and hatred. For Elizabeth and Swift Arrow, such concerns were secondary to the life they were building together, a life that straddled two worlds, drawing strength from both while acknowledging the challenges of each. By sunrise on their wedding day, Elizabeth had indeed become Swift Arrow's bride, not because she was forced to, but because she had found in him and his people the belonging she had never known she was seeking. As dawn broke over the Apache camp on the day after their wedding, Elizabeth stood outside their wickiup, watching the sun paint the desert in gold and crimson. Swift Arrow joined her, his arm encircling her waist, as they contemplated the vast landscape that was now their shared home. "No regrets?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. Elizabeth leaned into his embrace, feeling a sense of peace she had never known before. "None," she answered truthfully. "This is where I belong." And as the new day brightened around them, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that her desperate attempt to run from a wedding had led her exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of the Apache warrior who had once promised she would be his bride by sunrise, a promise that had become her most cherished reality.